On the morning of March the 18th, 1964, a 9-year-old girl left her house on Alter Street in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, carrying a paper bag of canned food. It was a school food drive. She was going to hand the cans to a nun, then sit through morning mass. The walk was 6 blocks. She was last seen at the corner of Sherman Court and West 4th Street. That corner is about 300 yards from her front door. 4 hours later, a man teaching his teenage nephew to drive stopped at a coal pit 2 miles outside town. He thought someone had thrown away a large doll. Pennsylvania State Police would work this case for 57 years. More than 230 troopers. 4,600 pages of files. Generations of investigators who retired without an answer. The man who did it was never questioned, not once. He lived 7 blocks away. To understand what happened in Hazleton, you have to understand what Hazleton was. In 1964, it was a coal town in the northeastern corner of Pennsylvania, about 80 miles north of Philadelphia. This is anthracite country, hard coal. For 100 years, the entire region ran on it, and the towns that grew up here grew up around the collieries. By the 1960s, that world was already ending. The mines had been closing for 2 decades. What remained was the landscape they left behind. Culm banks, which are mountains of black mining waste. Abandoned strip pits, which are open-cut excavations that fill with water and go quiet. Miles of scarred ground on the edge of every town, unfenced and unwatched. But the culture the coal built was still completely intact. Catholic parishes on every few blocks. Italian and Polish and Slovak and Irish families, 3 generations to a house. Streets where every adult knew every child by name and would tell your mother if they saw you misbehaving before you got home. It was the kind of town where a 9-year-old walked to school alone because there was nothing to walk into. Marise Ann Chiverella was in the 3rd grade at St. Joseph's, the parish school. She was the 4th of 5 children. Her older brother, Ronald, was 16. Her sister, Carmen, was 13. Her younger brothers, Barry and David, were 11 and 7. Her family described her later as shy. She was learning to play the organ. She had told people she wanted to become a nun. That week, the school was running a food drive for the poor of the parish. Every child was asked to bring canned goods. On the morning of the 18th, Marise packed hers and left the house on Alter Street a little after 8 o'clock. The plan was simple. Walk to school, give the cans to the sister, go to Mass. She never reached the school. The last confirmed sighting placed her at Sherman Court and West 4th Street. From there, the route to St. Joseph's was close to a straight line. There were houses on both sides. It was a Wednesday morning in a working town. People were leaving for shifts. Children were walking in groups. Cars were moving. Shops were opening. And somewhere in that ordinary stretch of pavement, in full daylight, on a street where 100 people should have been able to see her, a 9-year-old girl was taken. Nobody reported hearing a scream. Nobody reported seeing a struggle. Nobody remembered a car that did not belong on that street. That absence is the first strange thing about this case. and it stayed strange for 57 years. The alarm was not raised immediately. Marise was marked absent at St. Joseph's that morning. In 1964, an absence was not a crisis. Children were kept home for 100 reasons, and schools did not telephone parents the way they do now. The mark went in the register, and the day continued. The alarm came at midday, when she did not come home for lunch. Her family called the school. The school said she had never arrived. Within the hour, Hazleton police and the Pennsylvania State Police were moving, and word went through the town the way word moves through a town that size. Instantly, and everywhere at once, men walked off shifts. Neighbors came out on foot. People searched the alleys, the backyards, the sheds, the culm banks, the abandoned mine workings that sit all around Hazleton like open wounds. Hundreds of people were looking for her before the afternoon was out, but the search did not find her. A man out driving did.
His name was Arthur F. Robinson. He was 38 years old, and he was giving his 16-year-old nephew a driving lesson on the back roads outside town, near what is now the Hazleton Municipal Airport. There was a stripping pit out there, an abandoned open-cut coal excavation that local people had turned into an unofficial dump. You drove out, you threw away what you did not want, and you drove home. Nobody supervised it. Nobody cleared it. Robinson saw something in the pit. He thought it was a large doll somebody had discarded. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Marise Chiverella was 2 miles from the corner where she was last seen. She was still dressed. Her shoes had been taken off. Her wrists and ankles were bound with her own shoelaces. Her scarf had been used as a gag. She'd been struck on the head and on the right temple. She had been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was strangulation. The paper bag of canned food was on the ground beside her. She'd been dead for hours, which means that whoever took her off West 4th Street had most of that morning. He had a vehicle. He knew those back roads well enough to find a dumping ground 2 miles out that nobody would visit before nightfall. And in a town of 30,000 people, on a weekday morning, not one person saw him with her. What happened next in Hazleton is difficult to overstate. Corporal Mark Barron of the Pennsylvania State Police, the man who would eventually close this case, put it plainly when he spoke about it in 2022. He said it was a vivid memory for everybody who lived through it. He said what happened to Marise ushered in a change in that community. He meant something specific, and everyone from that generation understood it. Before March 1964, children in Hazleton walked. They walked to school, to the store, to church alone from the age of 6 or 7. After March 1964, they were driven. They walked in groups or not at all. Parents stood on porches and watched until their children were out of sight. A town that had never locked its doors started locking them, and it never stopped. The investigation was enormous by the standards of the time and the place. State police went house to house. They interviewed hundreds of people. The file that accumulated over the following decades would eventually run to more than 4,600 pages. At various points across the years,
More than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police worked some part of this case. They looked at local men with records. They looked at drifters and transients passing through the coal region. They looked at delivery drivers, at men who worked near that stretch of road, at anyone whose name came up more than once. They chased tips that arrived by telephone and by letter for years afterward, including anonymous ones. And they had physical evidence, which, in 1964, was both more and less than it sounds. 3 dark hairs were recovered from the victim. They were fluid stains on her jacket. Here is what that could do for an investigator in 1964. A hair could be mounted on a slide and examined under a comparison microscope. An analyst could describe it as consistent with or inconsistent with a known sample. That was the entire vocabulary. There was no way to say it came from one specific human being, and modern review has shown that microscopic hair comparison was far less reliable than courts of that era believed. Body fluids could be typed by blood group, A, B, AB or O, and in some cases a secretor status. That narrowed a suspect pool from every man in Pennsylvania to roughly 40% of every man in Pennsylvania. So the biology in that evidence room could exclude a man. It could very rarely point to one. You needed a confession or a witness or a suspect who did something stupid. In this case, there was no confession, no witness, and no suspect who did anything at all. So the case did what cases like this did. It stayed open, and it went quiet. Troopers who worked it in 1964 handed it to troopers who worked it in the 70s. Those men handed it on again. It became the file that every new investigator at that barracks was told about in their first week. The one that got pulled off the shelf every few years by somebody who thought they might see something the last man missed. Marise's parents lived the rest of their lives without an answer. Her brother Ronald grew up and grew old. Her sister Carmen married and became Carmen Marie Radke. Decades passed, and the only thing standing between that case and permanent silence was a decision somebody made in 1964 that nobody thought much about at the time. They kept her jacket. Evidence retention in 1964 was not a science.
There was no national standard, no climate-controlled storage, no chain of custody software, no barcodes, no audit trail. Departments kept what they had room for and got rid of what they did not. Property rooms were cleared when they filled up. Cases that were legally closed, or simply old, were thrown out to make space. An enormous number of American cold cases are permanently unsolvable today for exactly one reason. At some point, somebody threw the evidence away. Pennsylvania State Police did not throw Marise Chiverella's clothing away. It sat in storage unremarked, while the science of the world changed around it. DNA profiling entered criminal casework in the late 1980s. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, it became steadily more sensitive, able to work with smaller, older, and more degraded material than anyone had initially believed possible. In 2007, the Pennsylvania State Police DNA laboratory went back to the jacket. They were able to develop a full DNA profile of the man who killed her from a stain that had been sitting in an evidence room
for 43 years. On paper, that was the breakthrough. In practice, it was the beginning of a 15-year wait. Because a DNA profile by itself identifies nobody, it is a string of numbers. It becomes a name only when you can match it against something. The National Criminal Database, CODIS, holds profiles taken from convicted offenders and profiles taken from unsolved crime scenes. Investigators uploaded the Hazleton profile, and it was checked against every new entry, month after month, year after year. If the man who killed Marise Chiverella had ever been convicted of a qualifying felony after DNA collection began in the 1990s, he would have surfaced. He never surfaced. Not in 2007, not in 2010, not in 2015, which told investigators something, although it took years to understand exactly what. It meant he had not been convicted of a qualifying offense in the DNA era. And for a man capable of what was done to that child in decades when he would have been in his 50s and 60s, there were really only two explanations. Either he had never been caught again, or he was already dead. To understand how this case was finally broken, you have to leave Hazleton for a moment and go to Sacramento, California, in April of 2018. For more than 40 years, California had been hunting a man responsible for a campaign of burglaries, rapes, and murders across the state between 1976 and 1986. He had been given several names over the years: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, eventually the Golden State Killer. He was linked to 12 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries. His DNA had been on file for years. It matched nothing. Then investigators tried something that had never been used to close a case like this. They took the crime scene DNA profile and uploaded it to a free public website called GEDmatch. GEDmatch is not a law enforcement tool. It is a site where ordinary people upload results from consumer DNA tests so they can find relatives and build family trees. Hobbyists, adoptees looking for birth parents, people researching their ancestry. The upload did not find the killer. It found distant relatives of the killer, people who had never met him and did not know he existed. From there, a genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, working with investigator Paul Holes and their team, did something that had nothing to do with forensic science. They built family trees. They took those distant cousins, traced their ancestry backwards through public records until the family lines converged, and then traced forwards again through every descendant branch, eliminating anyone who was the wrong age, in the wrong place, or the wrong sex. On April the 24th, 2018, they arrested a 72-year-old former police officer named Joseph James D'Angelo. That arrest changed American cold case work permanently. Within months, agencies across the country were sending their oldest unsolved profiles to genealogists. The technique now has a name: investigative genetic genealogy. It also opened a debate that has not been settled. The people whose DNA cracked these cases never consented to being part of a police investigation. They uploaded their results to find a cousin, Genealogy platforms have since changed their policies, and users can now choose whether to allow law enforcement matching. But the underlying question remains uncomfortable, and it is worth naming. This method works because of the choices of people who are not suspects and have committed no crime. In Hazleton, Pennsylvania, investigators had been sitting on a usable DNA profile since 2007 with nothing to compare it against. Now, there was something. By 2019, the case had two new tools. Pennsylvania State Police sent the profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia company that works with crime scene DNA in two distinct ways.
The first is called phenotyping. It reads physical traits directly out of the genome. The lab reported that the man who killed Marise Chiverella had fair skin, hazel eyes, and dark hair, and that his ancestry was Southern European or Middle Eastern. Parabon then produced composite images of his likely appearance at three different ages: 25, 40, and 60. State police released them. They ran in the local press and spread across the internet. In a town where this case was the defining event of a generation, thousands of people looked very carefully at those three faces and asked their parents to look too. Nobody recognized him. Which left the second tool. And that is the one that actually ended this. The genealogical principle is the same one that worked in Sacramento. You do not need the offender's DNA to be in a database. You need his relatives' DNA to be in one. In 2019, the Hazleton profile went up on GED Match. The matches that came back were distant, very distant, at roughly the sixth cousin level. It is worth pausing on what that means. Two people who share a sixth cousin share one ancestral couple who were probably born in the 1700s. Between that couple and the two living matches, there are 7 or 8 generations and potentially thousands of living descendants spread across several continents. That is not a lead. That is a research problem that will take years. So the Pennsylvania State Police brought in someone to solve it. His name was Eric Schubert. In 2020, when he joined the case, he was a history major at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. He was 20 years old. He had also been doing genealogy since he was 10, and by then, he was running his own research practice. He volunteered on the Chiverella case. He was not paid for it. What he took on was, by his own account, the hardest thing he had ever attempted. He said afterwards, and this is a direct quote, "The investigation that went into all of this work was probably the hardest genealogy task that I've ever faced." He also said something that matters more, given what he was starting with. He said, "I knew we were going to find the assailant." Over the following 2 years, Schubert built more than 50 family trees. Understand what that means in practice, because the phrase makes it sound like data entry. Each tree begins with a single distant DNA match and works backwards through census returns, parish baptism and marriage registers, death certificates, obituaries, immigration manifests, city directories, land records, and newspaper notices. Every generation you go back, the number of people doubles, and the quality of the records gets worse.
Northeastern Pennsylvania in that era was one of the hardest research environments in the country for this work. It was a region built by immigration, where a family surname might be spelled 3 different ways in 3 different documents, depending on which clerk wrote it down. Where children were named after grandparents in every single generation, so a family tree contains 6 men with the same name across 100 years. Where entire branches vanish from the record because somebody moved or changed their name or died in a mine and was buried without paperwork. 50 trees, most of them dead ends. But slowly, the trees began to converge. Branches that had started from apparently unrelated matches turned out to run into each other. Common ancestry that had been 8 generations back moved to 7, then 6. The shared families narrowed. And this is where the genealogy and the police work met. Troopers went out and asked living relatives of those families to give voluntary DNA samples. Each sample that came back either confirmed a branch or eliminated it completely. And eliminating a branch removed hundreds of people from consideration at a stroke. From thousands of possible descendants, the pool came down to hundreds, then to dozens, then to 4 men, and then to 1. A man who had been born in Hazleton in 1941, had lived in Hazleton his entire life, and who in March of 1964 was 22 years old. His name was James Paul Forte. He had died in 1980. You cannot arrest a dead man, and you cannot convict one, but you can prove it. In January 2022, with the assistance of the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office, James Paul Forte's body was exhumed.
A tissue sample was taken and sent for analysis. It was compared against the profile developed from Marise Chiverella's jacket in 2007. It matched. On February the 10th, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference and said his name out loud for the first time in 57 years and 11 months. Corporal Mark Barron, who had carried this case for years, said what had to be said. Unfortunately, Mr. Ford is not alive for us to prosecute. However, he is the person that committed this crime. Investigators believed at the time that this was the 4th oldest cold case in the United States ever solved through investigative genetic genealogy, and the oldest ever solved in the state of Pennsylvania. So, who was he? James Paul Fort was a bartender. He also sold bar supplies. He never married and had no known children. He lived in Hazleton his whole life, 6 or 7 blocks from the Chiverella family home. Police stated they found no known connection between Fort and Marise, or between Fort and her family. He was not a relative. He was not a family friend. He was not someone who had any reason to be near her, or any grudge, or any history with the household. He was a man who lived in the same small town and who was on the same street that morning. And here is the part of this case that is hardest to sit with. 10 years after Marise Chiverella was murdered, in 1974, James Paul Fort was arrested on charges that included involuntary deviant sexual intercourse sexual assault, and aggravated assault. That case ended in a plea agreement. The conviction was for aggravated assault. The sentence was 1 year of probation. 1 year of probation. In 1978, he was arrested again on charges of reckless endangerment and harassment. In 1980, at the age of 38, he had a heart attack at the bar where he worked and died. He was never questioned about Marise Chiverella. Not in 1964. Not in 1974, when a sexual assault charge put him in front of a court in the same county. Not once in the 16 years he lived after her death. Because in 1964, the science that could have connected him to that jacket would not exist for another quarter of a century. And by the time it did, he had been in the ground for 27 years. Marise's sister, Carmen Marie Radke, spoke for the family at that press conference. She said, "We have so many precious memories of Marise. At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence." She said the family would go on asking themselves what would have been, what could have been. And then she said, "Thanks to the Pennsylvania State Police, justice has been served today." Her brother Ronald, who was 16 years old on the morning his little sister did not come home for lunch, was more careful with the word. He said that knowing the name gave them a sense of closure. And then he said, "No full closure. We'll never have that." Eric Schubert, the student who built 50 family trees for nothing, said this: "This was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life. It means so much to me that I was able to be on the team that could provide answers to the Chiverella family." He was 22 years old when the case closed, the same age James Paul Fort had been in March of 1964. There is a version of this story where nobody keeps a 9-year-old's jacket for 43 years. There is a version where the 2007 laboratory technician cannot pull a usable profile off a decades-old stain. There is a version where a 20-year-old college student looks at 50 dead-end family trees and decides he has coursework to do. In any of those versions, the answer stays in that coal pit forever. And it very nearly did. Marise Ann Chiverella was 9 years old. She was carrying canned food for people poorer than her own family. She was 6 blocks from her front door. It took 57 years, more than 230 troopers, 4,600 pages of file, and 50 family trees to write down the name of the man who took her. They wrote it down.